In the autumn of 1929, the sprawling halls of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul were undergoing a transformation. The former seat of the Ottoman Sultans, a place where empires had been ruled and conspiracies whispered for centuries, was being converted into a museum. Workers moved through dusty corridors, cataloguing treasures that had lain untouched for generations. Among those tasked with sorting through the palace's vast archive of non-Arabic materials was Gustav Adolf Deissmann, a German theologian and scholar who had been invited by the director of National Museums, Dr. George Halil Edhem Eldam, to examine the library's ancient holdings. It was tedious, painstaking work, the kind that demanded patience more than brilliance. But on one otherwise unremarkable day, a palace attendant handed Deissmann a bundle of old documents that had been tucked away, forgotten and unseen for centuries. As Deissmann carefully unfolded the brittle parchment, a fragment of gazelle skin, darkened by age and crusted with faded ink, he realized he was holding something extraordinary. The fragment measured roughly 90 centimeters high by 65 centimeters wide. Its surface was covered in Ottoman Turkish script, compass roses, and intricate illustrations of coastlines, ships, and exotic animals. It was a map, and it had been drawn by a man whose name was inscribed upon it, Piri Reis. The map had been created in 1513, more than 400 years before Deissmann's trembling hands unfurled it. Its maker, Ahmed Muhiddin Piri, known to history as Piri Reis, had been an Ottoman admiral, a former corsair who sailed the Mediterranean alongside his uncle Kemal Reis, raiding Spanish, Genoese and Venetian ships on behalf of the Ottoman Empire. Piri had spent a lifetime at sea, and during those decades he had collected charts, sketched coastlines, and studied the navigational records of every culture he encountered. When his uncle drowned in a shipwreck in 1511, Piri retired temporarily to the port town of Gallipoli on the Dardanelles. There, surrounded by the accumulated cartographic knowledge of a lifetime, he began assembling his masterpiece. In the marginalia of his map, written in elegant Ottoman Turkish, Piri Reis documented something remarkable. He listed the sources he had used. Approximately 20 charts and mappe mundi, 8 maps constructed in the tradition of Ptolemy, an Arabic map of India, 4 recently drawn Portuguese maps showing the coastlines of South Asia, and, most tantalizingly, a map drawn by Christopher Columbus himself, depicting the western lands Columbus had encountered on his voyages. This last detail electrified scholars when the map was rediscovered, because no map by Columbus's own hand has ever been found. The Piri Reis map, it seemed, contained within its lines the ghostly imprint of a lost Columbus chart, a hidden message from one of history's most consequential explorers, preserved by an Ottoman admiral who had likely obtained it through the spoils of naval warfare. The story of how Piri Reis came to possess a map by Columbus is itself a tale of conflict and chance. During one of the naval engagements fought alongside his uncle, Piri and Kemal Reis captured a Spanish sailor who had participated in Columbus's voyages to the New World. This prisoner, whose name has been lost to history, likely carried with him an early chart of the Americas, perhaps one of the working maps used during Columbus's expeditions. Piri incorporated this source into his own compilation, blending it with the knowledge of Portuguese, Arab, and ancient Greek cartographers to produce a single sweeping vision of the known world. The result was a map that depicted the coastlines of Western Europe, North Africa, and, with striking detail for its time, the eastern shores of South America. But it was not merely the geography that made the Piri Reis map extraordinary. It was the hidden text. Scattered across the map's surface were 30 legends, 29 written in Turkish and 1 in Arabic, containing observations, descriptions, and claims about the lands and peoples depicted. Some of these notes were practical, describing navigational hazards and coastal features. Others were fantastical, speaking of giant snakes in the jungles of South America and parrots with brightly colored feathers. But threaded through these annotations was something more subtle, a rhetorical strategy by which Piri Reis reframed the European voyages of discovery as the rediscovery of ancient knowledge. He invoked Duhu al-Qarnayn, a figure from the Quran often identified with Alexander the Great, who, according to Islamic tradition, had travelled to every corner of the world. By linking Columbus's discoveries to the journeys of Alexander, Piri Reis was embedding a hidden ideological message within his map, a quiet assertion that the Ottoman world already possessed, through its intellectual heritage, a claim to the knowledge that European powers were only now stumbling upon. After completing the map, Piri Reis presented it to Ottoman Sultan Selim I in 1517, following the Ottoman conquest of Egypt. What Selim did with the map, if anything, remains unknown. It vanished into the archives of the Topkapi Palace and was not seen again for more than 4 centuries, until Deisman's discovery in 1929. Only a fragment of the original survives, roughly 1/3 of what was once a much larger world map, but that fragment has been enough to generate decades of debate, speculation, and wonder. Today, the surviving portion resides in the archives of the Topkapi Palace, a silent witness to the age when Ottoman and European civilizations competed not only for territory, but for the very understanding of the world itself. But the Piri Reis map, for all its fame, is only one chapter in a much longer story. The tradition of concealing messages within maps stretches back thousands of years, to the very dawn of cartography itself. To find its earliest expressions, one must travel far from the shores of the Mediterranean, back through the corridors of time to the ancient city of Sippar, situated on the east bank of the Euphrates River, roughly 60 kilometers north of Babylon. It was here, in the ruins of a civilization that had flourished more than 2.5 millennia before Piri Reis was born, that an Assyrian-born British archaeologist named Hormuzd Rassam made a discovery in the late 19th century that would reshape our understanding of how ancient peoples saw the world. Rassam, who had worked alongside the legendary Austen Henry Layard in the excavations of Nineveh, was excavating the site of Sippar in 1882 when he unearthed the small clay tablet. It measured barely 12 centimeters across, small enough to hold in one hand, yet it contained what scholars would eventually recognize as the oldest known map of the world. The tablet, now known as the Babylonian Map of the World or the Imago Mundi, was acquired by the British Museum, where it has remained ever since, a fragile shard of baked clay that encapsulates an entire civilization's understanding of the cosmos. The map itself is deceptively simple. At its center sits the city of Babylon, marked by a rectangle through which the Euphrates River flows from north to south, its mouth labeled as a swamp and outflow. Surrounding the central landmass is a double circle representing what the Babylonian scribe called the Bitter River, a vast circular waterway that the Babylonians believed encircled the entire known world. Within this ring, small circles and rectangles mark the locations of various cities and regions. Susa, the capital of Elam, to the south, Urartu to the northeast, Haban, the capital of the Kassites, to the northwest. Beyond the Bitter River, extending outward like the rays of a star, are 8 triangular regions, mysterious lands that lay beyond the boundaries of the known world, inhabited by supernatural beings and mythical creatures. But the true hidden message of the Imago Mundi lies not in its geography, but in its cosmology. The tablet is inscribed on both sides with cuneiform text written in the Akkadian language, and when scholars finally deciphered these inscriptions, they discovered that the map was far more than a simple representation of physical space. It was a theological statement, a vision of the universe as the Babylonians understood it, blending geography, mythology, and astronomy into a single coherent whole. The triangular regions beyond the Bitter River were not merely unexplored territories, they were realms of gods and monsters, places where the scorpion man stood guard and the divine bird Anzu soared through celestial skies. In one of the triangular regions, the text describes a journey of 7 leagues to reach a place where one would find something thick as a parsiktu vessel. This rare term, parsiktu, appears in Babylonian literature almost exclusively in connection with the Ark of Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Noah 2000. In the ancient flood narrative, built a great vessel at the command of the god Ea to save his family and the animals of the earth from a devastating deluge. The significance of this detail was not fully appreciated until 1995, when a new fragment of the tablet was discovered, and again more recently when Dr. Irving Finkel, a curator at the British Museum and one of the world's foremost experts on cuneiform, undertook a fresh analysis of the inscriptions. Finkel's work revealed that the map contained a reference to the mountain where Utnapishtim's ark was said to have come to rest. A mountain the Babylonians called Urartu, which scholars believe corresponds to the biblical Mount Ararat. The Imago Mundi, in other words, was not just a map of the physical world. It was a map of a story, a cartographic encoding of the Babylonian flood myth, with the resting place of the ark marked upon it as a landmark of cosmological importance. The map's creators had hidden within its lines a narrative that connected the geography of their world to the deepest currents of their religious belief, a message that would remain unread for more than 2,000 years. From the clay tablets of Babylon to the calfskin parchments of medieval England, the story of hidden messages in maps leaps across centuries and continents. In 1855, workers at Hereford Cathedral in England, that ancient seat of worship near the Welsh border on the River Wye, made a discovery that had been waiting beneath their feet for decades. Hidden under the floor of Bishop Audley's votive altar, where it had been secreted during a period of political turbulence, lay a large calfskin canvas covered in faded ink illustrations. When it was carefully extracted and cleaned at the British Museum, the canvas was revealed to be one of the most extraordinary documents to survive from the Middle Ages, the Hereford Mappa Mundi, the largest medieval map of the world still in existence. The map is enormous, measuring 1.5 meters in length and 1.34 meters in width, constructed on a single sheet of vellum derived from the skin of a calf. It is attributed to a man named Richard of Haldingham and Lafford, whose name appears in an inscription in the map's bottom left corner. Unusual for a medieval map, which typically bore no such attribution. The inscription, translated from its original text, reads with a poignant directness across the centuries: "Let all who have this history, or shall hear or read or see it, pray to Jesus in his divinity to have pity on Richard of Haldingham and Lafford, who has made and planned it, to whom joy in heaven be granted." It is a personal plea from a mapmaker who understood that his work would outlive him, and who hoped that those who encountered it in future ages would remember him in their prayers. But the Hereford Mappa Mundi is far more than a map. It is an encyclopedia, a bestiary, a religious text, and a work of art, all compressed onto a single sheet of animal skin. More than 500 ink drawings cover its surface, depicting 420 cities and towns, 15 biblical events, 33 plants, animals and birds, and dozens of strange mythological creatures, drawn from medieval bestiaries and classical legend. The Minotaur lurks in the labyrinth of Crete. Elephants and camels roam the plains of Africa. In the far corners of the world, the map depicts monstrous races: the Blemii, headless men with faces in their chests; the Cyopods, creatures with a single enormous foot that they used as a parasol against the sun; and the Cynocephali, dog-headed men whose barking voices echoed through medieval legend. The map is oriented with east at the top, following medieval convention in which the rising sun and the anticipated second coming of Christ lay in that direction. Jerusalem sits at the exact center of the circular world, depicted as a fortified city with 8 towers or gates, reinforcing the biblical passage from the book of Ezekiel: "Thus says the Lord God, this is Jerusalem. I have set her in the center of the nations." At the very apex of the map, Christ sits enthroned in heaven, presiding over the world below. The Garden of Eden is depicted at the eastern edge of the world, a walled paradise from which Adam and Eve are shown being expelled. And somewhere on the map, though scholars debate the precise location, is a representation of Noah's Ark, resting on the mountains beyond the known world. But the hidden messages of the Hereford Mappa Mundi go far deeper than its surface illustrations. Recent scholarship has revealed layers of political, religious, and social meaning embedded within the map's imagery. Messages that were never meant to be read by casual observers, but were instead directed at specific audiences within the medieval church. The map, form the central panel of a triptych, a three-panel display, with the left panel depicting the angel Gabriel and the right panel showing the Virgin Mary in the scene of the Annunciation. This context gives the map particular associations with the cult of the Virgin Mary, which was a prominent feature of Christian worship at Hereford Cathedral during the late 13th century. More significantly, there is now an emerging scholarly consensus that the map was created, at least in part, to promote the cult of Thomas de Cantilupe, a bishop of Hereford who died in 1282 and was later canonized as a saint. Cantilupe was a deeply controversial figure, a powerful churchman who was, by the accounts that survive, fiercely hostile to the Jewish community in England and who actively campaigned for their expulsion from the country. The Jews were expelled from England in 1290, and the evidence presented for Cantilupe's canonization included his demands that they be removed. Scholars like Deborah Strickland have argued that the Hereford Mappa Mundi contains carefully embedded messages reflecting Cantilupe's views, images that conflate the biblical Exodus with the contemporary expulsion of England's Jews, and that present Judaism in deliberately hostile terms. A horned Moses appears on the map, alongside a depiction of Jews worshipping the golden calf, in the form that scholars have interpreted as deliberately derogatory. These were not accidental inclusions. They were hidden messages, encoded in the visual language of medieval cartography, intended to be read by those who shared the mapmaker's particular worldview. The map's own physical history tells another story of concealment. During the English Civil War and the political upheavals that followed, the Mappa Mundi was hidden beneath the cathedral floor to protect it from destruction. It remained there, forgotten, until its rediscovery in the mid-19th century. During the Second World War, it was removed from the cathedral and safeguarded in a secret location, not returning to Hereford until 1946. And in 1988, when a financial crisis threatened the Diocese of Hereford, the Dean and Chapter proposed selling the map. The prospect of losing this national treasure provoked an outcry, and large donations from the National Heritage Memorial Fund, the philanthropist Paul Getty, and members of the public ensured that the map remained in Hereford, where it is now displayed in a purpose-built library alongside the cathedral's famous chained collection of medieval manuscripts. Even the physical surface of the map bears traces of hidden stories. Modern 3D scanning has revealed that the area around the city of Paris has been scored through with angry lines. Deliberate marks that scholars believe were made at some point during the map's long history as an expression of anti-French sentiment. The image of Hereford itself, meanwhile, has been almost completely worn away, likely by the pointing fingers of countless visitors and pilgrims over the centuries, who located their own city on the map and touched the vellum in an act of recognition that slowly eroded the ink. While the Hereford Mappa Mundi concealed its messages in ink and illustration, another ancient map, one far older, predating even the Babylonian Imago Mundi in some respects, hid its secrets in stone. The story of the St. Belloc slab begins in the year 1900, in the remote countryside of Finistère, the westernmost department of Brittany in northwestern France. Paul du Châtelier, a local historian and amateur archaeologist, was excavating a prehistoric burial mound near the small town of Luhan when he uncovered something remarkable. Forming one wall of a stone burial chamber, a cist, was a massive slab of schist, roughly 2.2 meters long and 1.53 meters wide, weighing approximately 1 ton. One side of the slab was relatively smooth and covered in intricate carvings, patterns of lines, circles, ovals, and small hollowed-out depressions that seemed to follow some deliberate design. The other side was left rough and unworked. Du Châtelier recorded his find in his excavation reports and transported the slab to his residence, the Château de Kerneuse, some 40 kilometers southwest of Luhan. There, the slab was stored first in a niche in the castle's moat and later moved to its cellar. Du Châtelier died. His archaeological collection was eventually acquired by the National Archaeological Museum at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and the slab was forgotten. For more than a century it lay in storage, its carvings unseen and unstudied, a message from the Bronze Age that no one was reading. It was not until 2014 that the slab was rediscovered. Clément Nicolas, an archaeologist from Bournemouth University, and Yvon Payer, a professor at the University of Western Brittany, had independently read Du Chatelier's original excavation reports and come to a remarkable conclusion. The carvings on the slab might represent a map. They located the artifact in the cellar of the Château de Kernoz and began a systematic examination using high-resolution 3D surveying and photogrammetry. What they found astonished the archaeological world. The slab was not merely decorated. It was a three-dimensional representation of the landscape of the Odette River Valley in Western Brittany. The lines etched into the stone corresponded to rivers: the Odette, the Issel, the Sterlaer, while the surface of the slab itself had been deliberately shaped and modified to create a topography that matched the hills and valleys of the surrounding terrain. When Nicolas and Pailler compared the slab to modern maps of the region, they found an approximately 80% match over an area spanning roughly 30 by 20.1 kilometers. The implications were staggering. The Sambelek slab, dating to the early Bronze Age, approximately 2150 to 1600 BCE, likely around 1875 BCE, was the oldest known map of a specific territory ever identified in Europe, and quite possibly in the world. But the slab's hidden messages went beyond mere geography. The circular and oval motifs scattered across its surface, the small cut marks and depressions that punctuated the landscape, appeared to represent human-made features: settlements, burial mounds, field systems. A central circular motif, located near the sources of the three rivers, was interpreted as possibly representing the enclosure of a local ruler, a Bronze Age prince or king whose territory the map depicted. The researchers concluded that the map was not a navigational tool. It was a political statement, an assertion of territorial control, a Bronze Age cadastral plan that marked the boundaries of a principality and perhaps the ownership of the land within it. The fact that the slab had been deliberately broken and repurposed as part of a burial chamber toward the end of the early Bronze Age suggested something even more dramatic: an act of iconoclasm, the ritual destruction of the map as a symbol of the rejection or overthrow of the political entity it represented. Whoever had broken the slab was not merely disposing of a piece of stone. They were destroying a statement of power. Since the publication of their findings in the Bulletin de la Société Préhistorique Française in 2021, the research team has been using the slab as an actual archaeological guide, a treasure map, as Paillet described it, to locate undiscovered Bronze Age sites in the Brittany countryside. They have already found additional fragments of the original slab, and they estimate that the full survey of the territory depicted on the map will take approximately 15 years to complete. The geometric symbols remain only partially decoded, and each small hollow in the stone surface could point to a burial mound, a settlement, or a geological feature that has remained hidden for 4,000 years. The tradition of encoding hidden knowledge within maps found one of its most unusual expressions not in stone or parchment but in metal. In the spring of 1952, a team of archaeologists working in the caves near Khirbet Qumran on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea entered what would become known as Cave 3. The Qumran caves had already yielded one of the 20th century's greatest archaeological discoveries, the Dead Sea Scrolls, a collection of more than 850 documents dating to the 2nd century BCE, including portions of the Hebrew Bible, religious commentaries, and community rules belonging to a Jewish sect that many scholars identify as the Essenes. But Cave 3 held something that defied all expectations. On March 14, 1952, at the back of the cave, the archaeologists found 2 rolls of oxidized copper, so corroded by 2 millennia of exposure that they could not be unrolled without crumbling to dust. The rolls were sent to the College of Technology at Manchester University in England, where Professor H. Wright Baker, on the recommendation of the Dead Sea Scrolls scholar John Marco Allegro, carefully cut the copper sheets into 2003 strips between 1955 and 1956. When the strips were reassembled and the text engraved upon them was finally read, the scholarly world was stunned. The Copper Scroll, as it came to be known, was not a religious text, not a psalm or a prophecy or a community rule. It was a list of treasure, inscribed in a form of Hebrew closer to the later Mishnaic dialect than to the literary Hebrew of the other Dead Sea Scrolls. The Copper Scroll catalogues 67 CPZs where vast quantities of gold, silver, coins and sacred vessels had been hidden. The entries were terse and utilitarian, reading like the entries of a ledger rather than the flowing prose of scripture. In the fortress, which is in the Vale of Achor, 40 cubits under the steps entering to the east, a money chest and its contents of a weight of 17 talents. In the cavity of the old house of tribute, in the chain platform 65 bars of gold wire. 42 talents lie under the stairs in the salt pit. The total quantity of precious metal described in the scroll has been estimated at more than 4,600 talents, a staggering fortune that, by modern valuations, would be worth billions of dollars. The Copper Scroll was, in essence, a treasure map, one of the oldest in the world and certainly the most mysterious. But unlike a pirate's chart with a convenient X marking the spot, the Copper Scroll's directions were maddeningly vague, referencing landmarks, buildings and place names that had long since vanished from the landscape. 2,000 years of earthquakes, erosion and human construction had transformed the Judean wilderness beyond recognition, and the scroll's cryptic language, using terms and names that scholars did not recognize, made it nearly impossible to identify the locations it described. Mysterious marginal notations in Greek letters appeared at the ends of some entries, their purpose entirely unknown. Were they abbreviations? Code names? A secondary layer of encryption designed to protect the treasure's locations from unauthorized readers. The question of whose treasure the Copper Scroll describes has been debated for decades. Some scholars, including Professor Richard Freund, have argued that the treasure belonged to the temple in Jerusalem, sacred wealth that was smuggled out and hidden before the Romans sacked the city and destroyed the temple in 70 CE during the First Jewish Revolt. Others have suggested a connection to the earlier Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 CE, when Jewish refugees fled into the Judean wilderness and hid in caves to escape Roman retribution. The fact that the scroll was inscribed on copper, an expensive and virtually indestructible material, suggests that whoever created it wanted the information to survive, and that the treasure it described was real. The choice of copper over parchment was itself a hidden message. This was information deemed too important to entrust to materials that could rot, burn, or crumble. One of the most extensive attempts to locate the scroll's treasure was led by John Allegro himself in 1962. Following the clues inscribed on the copper strips, his team excavated numerous sites in the Judean desert near Qumran and Jericho, searching cisterns, caves, and subterranean passages. They returned empty-handed. In more recent years, Jim Barfield, an American investigator, used triangulation techniques based on the scroll's descriptions and claimed to have identified some of the locations in the area surrounding Qumran. But, despite decades of searching, not a single item of treasure described in the Copper Scroll has ever been recovered. The scroll's final entry at 64th hints at an even greater mystery. It describes a second document, a copy of the Copper Scroll itself, complete with an explanation and a detailed inventory, hidden in a dry well at a place called Kolit. This second scroll, if it exists, has never been found. It is a map to a map, a hidden message pointing to another hidden message, disappearing into the desert sands like a whisper lost in the wind. In the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, a large and badly faded map had hung on the wall outside a reading room for years, attracting little more than passing glances from the scholars who walked by it each day. The map had been created in 1491 by Henricus Martellus, a German cartographer, also known by his birth name, Heinrich Hammer, who lived and worked in Florence during the last decades of the 15th century. The map depicted the known world as Europeans understood it on the eve of Columbus's first voyage, synthesizing the geographical observations of Claudius Ptolemy, the travel accounts of Marco Polo, and the recent Portuguese explorations of the African coast. It showed no trace of the Americas. They had not yet been reached by European ships, but it depicted the coastlines of Europe, Africa, and Asia in remarkable detail, with Japan shown as a large island roughly 1,000 miles off the Asian coast. For years, the map was too faded to read. 5 centuries of exposure to light, air, and handling had obscured much of its surface, turning the once vivid inks into ghostly shadows barely distinguishable from the aged parchment beneath. Then, in a research project funded by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, a team of researchers and imaging specialists, led by the map historian Chet Van Duzer, subjected the Martellus map to multispectral imaging, photographing it in 12 different wavelengths of light, including several frequencies beyond the range of human vision. The results were extraordinary. Hidden beneath the faded surface of the map, invisible to the naked eye, were more than 60 place names and Latin descriptions that had been completely obscured by centuries of deterioration. The hidden texts revealed a wealth of previously unknown information about late 15th century European geographical knowledge. Over northern Asia, a text box described the people of a region called Bala, noting that they lived primarily on a diet of venison. Another passage described the Panotii, a legendary people who were said to possess ears so enormous that they could wrap them around their bodies and sleep in them like blankets. They were evidence of the specific sources Martellus had used in constructing his map, and Van Duzer's analysis revealed that those sources included a manuscript version of Marco Polo's travelogue, different from the printed Latin edition that scholars had previously assumed was available, as well as Ptolemy's Egyptus Novello map, which was based on information from native African informants rather than European exploration. Perhaps most significantly, the multispectral imaging revealed the extent to which the Martellus map had influenced later cartographers. The hidden texts showed unmistakable connections between Martellus's work and the 1507 world map of Martin Waldseemüller, the famous German cartographer who produced the first map to use the name America for the newly discovered lands across the Atlantic. Waldseemüller's map, created in the small town of Saint-Dié in Lorraine, France, had christened the New World in honor of the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci, whose published accounts of his voyages to the coast of South America had convinced European scholars that Columbus had discovered not a new route to Asia, but an entirely new continent. Waldseemüller printed approximately 1,000 copies of his map, but only a single complete example is known to survive, discovered in 1901 by the Jesuit historian Joseph Fischer in the library of Prince Johannes zu Waldburg-Wolfegg at Schloss Wolfegg in southern Germany, where it had been bound into a volume belonging to the 16th century mathematician Johannes Schoner. In 2003, the Library of Congress purchased this sole surviving copy for $10 million, and in 2007, German Chancellor Angela Merkel formally transferred it to American custody in a ceremony at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. The hidden connections between the Martellus and Waldseemüller maps, revealed by multispectral imaging, opened a window into the mapmaker's workshop. Van Duzer's research showed that Waldseemüller had consulted Martellus's earlier work as a primary source, borrowing geographical details, place names, and textual descriptions from the 1491 map to construct his own revolutionary vision of the world. It was, as Van Duzer observed, easy to imagine Waldseemüller sitting at his desk in Saint-Dié, surrounded by charts and manuscripts, consulting Martellus's map alongside the accounts of Vespucci and other explorers as he assembled the document that would give an entire hemisphere its name. The hidden texts of the Martellus map, invisible for 500 years, had preserved within their faded ink a record of how knowledge travelled from one mapmaker to another, how geographical understanding accumulated and was transmitted across generations, and how the map that named America was itself built upon the concealed foundations of an earlier, forgotten work. The story of ancient maps with hidden messages is, in the end, a story about the human desire to communicate across time, to encode knowledge, belief, power, and identity into physical objects that might outlast their creators by centuries or millennia. The Babylonian scribe who inscribed the Imago Mundi onto a clay tablet in the 7th century BCE was not merely drawing a picture of the world, he was encoding his civilization's deepest convictions about the structure of the cosmos, hiding within the map's geometry a narrative about creation, divine order, and the resting place of a legendary ark. The unknown Bronze Age sculptor who carved the St. Bellic slab in Brittany around 1875 BCE was not merely recording the course of rivers, he was asserting political dominion over a territory, creating a three-dimensional statement of power that would be ritually destroyed when that power was overthrown. The Ottoman admiral Piri Reis, drawing his map on gazelle skin in the port of Gallipoli in 1513, was not merely charting coastlines. He was weaving together the knowledge of a dozen cultures and embedding within his annotations a quiet argument about the continuity of Islamic geographical knowledge in the face of European expansion. Richard of Holdingham, working on his great calfskin canvas in late 13th century England, was not merely depicting the world as medieval Christians understood it. He was encoding political and religious messages about the cult of a controversial saint, about the relationship between Christianity and Judaism, about the expulsion of an entire people from their homeland. The anonymous authors of the Copper Scroll, hammering their cryptic text into sheets of metal in the caves near the Dead Sea, were not merely making a list, they were creating one of history's most enduring mysteries, a treasure map inscribed on a medium chosen specifically for its permanence, designed to survive the destruction of everything around it. And Henricus Martellus, painting his vision of the world in Florence in 1491, was not merely preparing a geographical reference. He was creating a document that would carry hidden knowledge forward through time, its faded texts waiting 500 years for the technology that could finally make them visible again, revealing in the process the intellectual chain that connected his work to the map that gave the Americas their name. These maps are not merely artifacts, they are messages in bottles, cast into the ocean of time by men who understood that the surface of a map could conceal as much as it revealed. Some of those messages were meant to be found. Piri Reis's annotations, openly recorded in Ottoman Turkish, were intended for the Sultan's eyes. Others were hidden deliberately. The political symbolism of the Hereford Mappamundi was legible only to those who shared its creator's worldview and understood the visual language of medieval iconography. Still others were hidden by accident. The faded texts of the Martellus map were concealed not by intent, but by the slow erasure of time, their secrets preserved only by the durability of the materials on which they were inscribed. What unites them all is the recognition that a map is never merely a map. It is a statement of how its creator understood the world, not just its physical geography, but its political structure, its spiritual meaning, its hidden treasures, and its place in the cosmic order. Every line drawn on a map is a choice, every label an assertion, every blank space an admission of ignorance or a deliberate act of concealment. The hidden messages of ancient maps remind us that the act of mapping has always been an act of interpretation, and that beneath the surface of every chart and atlas lies a deeper layer of meaning, waiting for the right eyes, or the right technology, to bring it into the light. The search for those hidden messages continues. In the cellars of museums and the archives of libraries, in the ruins of ancient cities and the caves of the Judean desert, maps and map-like objects remain unexamined, their secrets intact. The St. Bellic slab alone may require 15 more years of fieldwork before its full meaning is understood. The Copper Scroll's 64 treasure locations remain undiscovered. The missing portions of the Piri Reis map, the 2/3 of the original that have never been found, may still exist somewhere in the archives of the Topkapi Palace or in collections yet unexamined, and somewhere in the faded surfaces of other ancient documents, multispectral imaging and other technologies of the future may yet reveal texts, drawings, and messages that have been invisible for centuries. The ancient map makers knew something that we are only now beginning to fully appreciate, that a map is not just a tool for finding your way through the world, it is a way of speaking across time, of encoding the knowledge, beliefs and ambitions of one generation in a form that might survive to be discovered, decoded and understood by another. The hidden messages of ancient maps are still being read, and the most remarkable ones may yet be those that we have not found.